Shalom. Pura vida, mi gente. Pura vida is what we say in my part of Mesoamerica. It means pure life. Are you living pure life? Thanks for being here again. In these next three parts, we will discuss the process of enslavement of the American Indian, the change from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. This is an untold part of history that was not told to us in school. All we got is images and stories of, like West Africans, being enslaved, chained up, and dropped off on this side. Well, real history, what can be researched and studied, it tells a whole different, foundational truth. I hope, that in the last parts of this series, you already know, who was the real or the true indigenous aboriginals of America, the copper-colored tribes of America, and who the Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch were really enslaving. Alright, when you go research that, you'll see who they were really enslaving, and whose identity has been changed in the paper genocide that was committed. Yes, a paper genocide. Alright, not just physical genocide, but also a paper genocide. So I'm gonna read a lot in these next two parts. I hope it doesn't get boring for y'all, but I think it's good information to be aware of, so we can proceed with the research in the next parts that I got coming, because they're gonna get really good. So I hope you like them. And again, thanks for being here. Pura vida. All right, now we're in the Smithsonian.com website, and it says here, Colonial America depended on the enslavement of indigenous people. All right, Smithsonian.com. The role of enslaving Native Americans in early American history is often overlooked. It has been overlooked, but not anymore. By Marissa Fessenden, Smithsonian.com. Textbook and classroom lesson plans are starting to present a more clear-eyed view of America's history, such as slowly recognizing the violence that happened when European settlers encountered the indigenous people of the so-called New World. So-called New World, right? Because this is the true Old World. But there are still many overlooked stories. One of these startling omissions to the history books is something Margaret Ellen Newell is calling attention to in her book, Brethren by Nature. And we went through this book actually a little bit in part 3 of this series. Colonists living in New England relied on the labor of thousands of Native Americans to build their new lives. All right, so they depended, again, these early colonists of New England depended on the Indians to become successful, to establish their settlements. The enslavement of New England's indigenous people was glossed over in the work of historians after World War I. Newell says, as Tanya H. Lee reports for Indian Country Today, Newell, an associate professor of history of Ohio State University, writes that historians reconstructed the compelling narrative of the Puritan migration. Many of these works stress the uniqueness of New England culture and saw there the origins of American exceptionalism. During the course of research in her first book, From Dependency to Independence, Economic Revolution in Colonial New England, Newell came across a list of Native American slaves kept by colonists in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She was surprised by the find because she had been taught that New England colonists didn't keep Native Americans as slaves because they often ran away. But that impression was incorrect. Lee writes, the colonial economy depended on slavery. Many well-to-do households functioned only because of slavery. Early colonial legal codes were devised to justify slavery, and the Pequot War and King Philip's War were fought in large measure to perpetuate slavery. You see, they were just doing, and they created these wars, right, just so they can perpetuate slavery. Right here it says Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. All right, so now we're going to go to page 118. All right, so this would be chapter 5 in this book, and it says here processes of enslavement. All right, because there's different ones. So this topic, this chapter would talk about warfare. All right, so of the processes in vogue among the English for the acquisition of Indian slaves, the most productive was that of warfare. With the exception of the Pequot War and King Philip's War in New England, the Indian wars in the English colonies were confined to the South, and there the greatest number of Indian war captives were enslaved. All right, where? In the South. After the Indian Massacre of 1622 in Virginia, there was published in London in the same year a tract entitled The Relation of the Barbarous Massacre in Time of Peace and League, treacherously executed by the native infidels upon the English, the 22nd of March, 1622, published by authority. The general trend of the tract is to show the good that might result to the plantation from this disaster. Number 5 of the possible results reads, because the Indians who before were used as friends may now most justly be compelled to servitude. In mind, servitude, not slavery, servitude. Remember that. And the like, of whom some may be sent for the use of the summer islands. And I think that was either Bahamas or Barbados. All right, the Summer Islands Company. We're going to read about that in the next video. All right, we'll tell you who exactly created that company. And I think you're going to see King James involved in this. The policy advocated by the tract was carried out in succeeding Indian wars in Virginia. The accounts of a certain Thomas Smallcombe, lieutenant at Fort Royal on Pamunkey, who was probably killed in the war with Ope Chankanu, show him possessed at the time of his death, 1646, of several Indian slaves. It seems probable that these slaves were captives in war. After his rebellion in 1676, Bacon sold some of his Indian prisoners. The rest were disposed of by Governor Berkeley. From the beginning of the colony, the settlers of Carolina were in trouble with the Indians. In September 1671, war was declared against the Kuso, a tribe on the southern frontier, who posed as allies of the Spaniards. Alright, so this tribe was allied with the Spaniards, the Kuso, and who vexed the Carolina settlers with petty depredations. The Kuso were quickly defeated, and the prisoners sent to be sold out of the colony, unless ransomed by their countrymen. During the war with the Stono Indians in 1680, the captive Indians were brought to Charleston and sold by Governor West to the traders in the colony to be carried to the West Indies as slaves. Again, Indians, right? Being sent to the West Indies as slaves or servants. We're in the website called chronicle.com, and this is the Chronicle of Higher Education. Do you want some higher education, or do you want to follow fantasies and fairy tales, right? This is by Margaret Ellen Newell, again, I believe the same author of the Brethren by Nature book. And it says, ruthless European slave traders, emptying villages and forcing terrified victims onto ships bound for the Atlantic. Lines of chained humans marching toward the slave markets under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Violent slave owners using torture and rape to force more work out of their captives. These searing images might bring to mind the terrible history of African slavery in the United States. But in fact, listen to this, my people, they actually describe historical events in the Bahamas, Central Mexico, and the American continent's western frontier. And the slaves were Indians, not African. They were Indians. These pictures, they were pointing in your head, right? What the movie Roots tries to put in your head, that they're Africans, are actually what happened in real historical events in the Bahamas, Central Mexico, and the American continent's western frontier. And these slaves were your ancestors, you so-called Negro Indians. In popular culture and in scholarship, slavery is having a moment All right, so again, they're telling us that it's changing the view, right? Racial strife in the present is drawing new attention to the racialized injustice and inequality in our past. Recent and acclaimed books by Edward Baptist, Swen Beckert, and Walter Johnson have illuminated the economic calculations behind planter cruelty and the connections among slavery, capitalism, and American expansion. But these books and movies like 12 Years a Slave have also reinforced the popular black and white image of slavery. That's true. They're still making you think you're African. An injustice perpetrated by whites against Africans and their descendants mainly in the antebellum South. This image is about to change though. Thanks to a slew of works on Native American slavery, a relatively new field that gained energy from the explosion of interest in American Indian studies since the 1980s. So when people actually started really studying actual historical written chronicles and facts and records, all right, it's when you started realizing there was actually a Native American slave or American Native slavery, because they tried to hide it. They didn't tell us. They kept this part out of the textbooks. Recent research has shown us that most enslaved persons in the Americas before 1700 were Indians. Before the 1700s were Indians. That Indians constituted a sizable proportion of the global slave population thereafter, and that Europeans enslaved Indians from Quebec to New Orleans and from New England to the Carolinas. Works such as Pekka Hamalainen's The Comanche Empire, Yale University Press have explored changing traditions of slavery within Native American societies, while other scholars, notably Alan Galley and Brett Rushforth, have tackled the enslavement of Indians by French and English colonists. All right, so we're in the book now. It's called Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. All right, so there's research behind this, okay? And her sources, you'll see in her footnotes, are very scholarly, all right, and historical. And it says here, abstract, or I guess like the introduction. It says here, indigenous resistance made Caribbean colonization a slow and violent process in the period of 1580 to 1690. All right, again, 1580, 1690. The Caribbean Indians who rejected colonization became targets for enslavement. Slavers captured indigenous people in raids or through trade within indigenous dominated territories. I conceptualize this space as Caribana. Geographically, it stretched from Guyana northward throughout islands of the Lesser Antilles. I focus on the indigenous captives from Caribana who were enslaved in English and Dutch colonies, namely Barbados, Curaçao, and Suriname. I show how colonists justified enslaving indigenous people in the same manner as they justified the transatlantic African slave trade. All right, so she's telling you, just like the so-called transatlantic slave trade, it was happening here way before that. Just like it, despite widespread taboos against the former practice and not the latter. You see? So, because they always acknowledge the latter, right, which is called the transatlantic, but we already know that's in reverse, but they ignore what's happened before the so-called transatlantic slave trade happened. These taboos did not prevent Indian slavery, but they influenced the creation of 17th century histories, government reports, and other material for public and European consumption. Indian slavery has thus been written about, then and now, as limited phenomenon wherein Indians had limited and specific labor roles, example as fishermen or domestic servants, indentured servants, encomenda. However, sources such as deeds and tax rolls show that more Indian slaves than assumed contributed a broad range of skills to plantations economies. So more Indian slaves assumed, meaning more than what they have told us. actually contributed to a broad range of skills to plantation economies. English Barbados was exceptionally successful because it was geographically separated from the conflicts that created captives in Caribana, but nevertheless extracted Indian slaves from the region. Meanwhile, colonies abutted in Caribana, such as Suriname, faced trade sanctions from neighboring Indians and rebellions if they abused the Indian slave trade. Indian slave trade. From 1670s to 1690s, colonial governments limited the means of accessing Indian slaves, but once enslaved, they faced the same restrictive black codes. You hear this? Black codes that allowed the brutal treatment of them as inheritable chattel. All right, we're just talking about American Indians, not Africans. All right, so now we're in this book or article written from the Wesleyan University. It says here the Honors College. It says Forging New Communities, Indian Slavery and Servitude in Colonial New England, 1676-1776, by Bernard J. Lillis, class of 2012, a thesis submitted to the faculty of Wesleyan University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Bachelor of Arts with departmental honors in history, all right, for 2012. So we're in page 98, chapter 3. It says here, to prevent Indians and Negroes being raided with horses and hogs, the shift from slavery to indenture in the early 18th century. And it says here, on April 24th, 1704, North America's first continuously published newspaper, the Boston News Letter, printed its first issue. About a month later, the Boston Newsletter printed its first slave advertisement. 2 Negro men, 1 Negro woman, and child to be sold by Mr. John Coleman, merchant, to be seen at Colonel Charles Hobby Esquire, his house in Boston. Over the next 12 years, the Boston Newsletter printed 272 advertisements for the sale of roughly 411 individual African or Indian men and women. All right, so dodge the hijack. When they say African, you're gonna hear this word a lot on this article. Of course, they gotta throw it in there. We've been doing the research. We've seen that most of these people coming that they were calling African, so-called Negroes, really that in the records they're called Negro, not African. We're actually coming mostly from South America, West Indies, the Spanish colonies in Central America. Continuing, of these 227 advertisements were for Negro, all right, Negro, not African, slaves, and 45 advertisements for, or about 16.5%, were for Indians. Of the 54 Indian men, women, and children who were sold through the Boston Newsletter in this period, 33 were Indians, which is to say probably New England Indians, 17 were Carolina Indians, 3 were Spanish Indians, and 1 was Suriname Indians. All right, Suriname, we just got that, right? Although roughly 60% of African slaves advertised were men, all right, remember, dodge your own hijack, Indian slaves were about equally divided between men and women. Taken together, these advertisements demonstrate the existence of a significant slave trade in Boston. Boston had no central slave market, and merchants sold slaves out of the homes or through the post office. All right, the post office was involved in this, where the Boston Newsletter was printed. In the early 18th century, the New England slave trade grew in response to labor shortages caused by constant border conflicts with the French and their Indian allies, and epidemics. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic in Boston killed nearly 1 in 12 Bostonians, and possibly as much as a third of the town's enslaved workforce. All right, so smallpox, didn't that kind of like, devastate the Indians? So are they talking about Indians, these Bostonians, and this slave workforce? Are these all Indians? Although Africans formed the heart of the slave trade in Boston, Indians constitute a small but significant number of advertised slaves, and at the dawn of the 18th century, Indians in New England were routinely sold as chattel. However, the threat posed by Indian resistance to slavery and the anxiety which the relationship between free Indian communities and Indian slaves inspired in English colonists ultimately led to the failure of English efforts to enslave native people and the institution of new ways to capture Indian labor through debt, peonage, judicial slavery, and indentured servitude. It was easier to enslave you or get you to commit or do a contract, get you to basically control you or use your services. It was just easier that way than to, physically just enslave you with chains and stuff. Advertisements for runaway slaves in the Boston newsletter complicate the story told by for sale advertisements. Between April 1704 and October 1719, 53 advertisements were printed in the Boston newsletter for Indian and African runaway slaves or servants. Slaves or servants, advertising 77 escapees. Now listen to this. Of these 77 individuals, 29 were Negro, that's American Indian. 8 were mulatto, again, American Indian. And 40 were Indian. We're just talking about so-called, copper-colored tribes of America, the so-called Negro, right? Or African American today. Of which 22 were from New England, 10 were from Carolina Indians, 7 were Spanish Indians, and 1 was Suriname Indian. Thus, although Indians made up only 13% of the slaves advertised for sale between 1704 and 1717, they constituted a significantly larger portion of advertisements for runaway slaves. So more runaway advertisements were about Indians. We've shown that in the other videos, right? You got to see how a lot of the runaway advertisements were saying, full-blooded Indian, of the Indian breed, Negro of the Indian breed, or bright mulatto Negro, speaks Mi'kmaq, things like that. All right. And about 52%, it says, of the runaway ads were about Indians. Now I want to read this to you. It's called here, The Forgotten Story of American Indian Slavery. Very good article I found online. It says this article is one of many in the Educational Teacher's Guide, South Carolina Indians Today, edited by William Morrow Goins, PhD. So this is to help, I guess, the teachers in South Carolina. When Americans think of slavery, our minds create images of Africans inhumanly crowded aboard ships, plying the Middle Passage from Africa, or of blacks stooped to pick cotton in southern fields. We don't conjure images of American Indians chained in coffles and marched to ports like Boston and Charleston, and then shipped to other ports in the Atlantic world. Yet Indian slavery and an Indian slave trade were ubiquitous in early America. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, tens of thousands of America's native peoples were enslaved, many of them transported to lands distant from their homes. All right, tens of thousands of America's native people were enslaved. All right, and they were taken to distant lands. And how were they taken there? Ships. They didn't have teleportation machines or planes. Ships. Our historical mythology posits that American Indians could not be enslaved in large numbers because they too readily succumbed to disease when exposed to Europeans, and they were too wedded to freedom to allow anyone to own them. Yet many indigenous people developed resistance to European diseases after being exposed to newcomers for well over a century. You're still here. And it is a racist conception that inferior Africans accepted their debased position as slaves, a status that American Indians and Europeans presumably could never have accepted. This is gross misconception of history. We are just scratching the surface of what this all means. Alright, we're just scratching the surface, and we're gonna show you. I'm showing you. For the enslavement of Indians forces us to rethink not only the institution of slavery, but the evolution of racism and racist ideologies in America. It's all linked. In the 17th century, Europeans, Africans, and American Indians all accepted slavery as a legitimate social institution. Treatment and status of the enslaved varied greatly from group to group. War captives provided most slaves, though the Europeans made slavery inheritable. Africans and Indians did exchange slaves as commodities, but Europeans introduced an international market economy for labor as colonial plantation societies developed an insatiable demand for workers, spurring the African slave trade, as well as various forms of bond labor for impoverished Europeans. In the American South, European traders mostly British colonists, operating out of Charlestown, South Carolina, engaged local and distant American Indian tribes to undertake slaving against their neighbors. You hear that, right? Who could be made to walk the ships that would carry them to Barbados, New York, Antigua, and other ports in the Atlantic world, where they would work as slaves. So to the West Indies, right? All right, we're going to read from this article in this journal. It's called Indian Slavery in Colonial Georgia by Rodney M. Bain. This is from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, volume 79, number 2, summer of 1995, pages 418 to 424. All right. It is well known that slavery was prohibited in Georgia soon after its founding. Far less recognized is the fact that the prohibition applied only to black slaves, so-called black. A bylaw adopted by the trustees in 1733 theoretically prohibited Indian traders from using any Negro or other slave in the Indian country. But the 1735 law, which more unequivocally banned the importation and use of slaves, applied only to blacks, not to Indians. Indian slaves served in the colony from its founding, but have been generally ignored by most historians. Of course, slavery was not a new concept by the time the English colonized the coast of southeastern North America, nor had it been introduced by the Spanish who preceded them. Slavery had long been a way of life among the various Indian nations, but the practice was much expanded during the 17th and 18th centuries, when thousands of southeastern Indians were captured by warring tribes and marauding whites were sent into bondage farther north or in the West Indies, far removed from their own tribes. All right, now we're in this article. It's called Slavery and Native Americans in British North America and the United States, 1600 to 1865 by Tony Saber. All right, we're just gonna go to this part right here, when the Europeans arrive. All right, so it says here, once Europeans arrived as colonialists in North America, the nature of Indian slavery changed abruptly and dramatically. Indians found that British settlers, especially those in the southern colonies, eagerly purchased or captured Indians to use as forced labor in cultivating tobacco, rice, and indigo. All right, they didn't use Africans, they used Indians. All right, more and more Indians began selling war captives to whites rather than integrating them into their own societies as they used to do before the Europeans arrived. And as the demand for labor in the West Indies became insatiable, whites began to actively enslave Indians for export to the so-called Sugar Islands. All right, that includes Jamaica, right? The resulting Indian slave trade devastated the southeastern Indian populations and transformed Native American tribal relations throughout the region. The English at Charlestown, the Spanish in Florida, and the French in Louisiana sought trading partners and allies among the Indians, offering trading goods such as metal knives and axes, firearms and ammunition, intoxicants and beads, and clothes and hats in exchange for furs, deerskins, and Indian slaves captured from other tribes. Unscrupulous traders, frontier settlers, and government officials encouraged Indians to make war on other tribes to reap the profits from the slaves captured in such raids, or to weaken the warring tribes. The breaking out of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 gave Governor Moore, a chance to attack the Spanish Indians, capture and sell them under the excuse of the rules of war. Therefore, in 1702, he led a force of militia and Indians against St. Augustine, burned the city, and carried off as slaves whatever Indians he could obtain from the Spanish Indian villages along the way. A second attack on St. Augustine was made by Moore in 1704 with the purpose of destroying missions and carrying off slaves. An advance into the territories of the Appalachee resulted in the destruction of several missions and the capture of more than 1,000 Indians, some free, some slave. Nearly all the Appalachee were distributed as slaves among the Carolina settlers. All right, now see who they're putting in these plantations, right? Carolinas. All right, the enslavement of Indians indeed was carried on wholesale. A letter to the proprietors, July 10, 1708, states that the garrison of St. Augustine is by this war reduced to the bare walls, their cattle and Indians' towns, all consumed, either by us in our invasion of that place or by our Indian subjects. They have driven the Floridians to the islands of the Cape, have brought in and sold many hundreds of them, and many now continue that trade, so that in some 5 years they'll reduce the barbarians to a fearless number. They're talking about American Indians. In 1708, Colonel Barnwell of South Carolina made an expedition to the Appalachian province of Florida. It is thought that this was the time when Captain Naim of South Carolina, with a party of Yamasee Indians, advanced to the vicinity of Lake Okeechobee and brought back a number of captive Indians as slaves. A similar expedition of Colonel Palmer in 1727 against the Yamasee resulted in the destruction of many Indian towns, the slaughter of many natives, and the carrying off of great numbers to Charleston as slaves. All right, so we're at Charleston. We know Charleston was a big slave port, basically where a lot of the American Indians were sent out to other parts of the world. We're talking about including Europe and West Africa. All right. As the result of the 3 expeditions sent by South Carolina from 1702 to 1708 against the Yamasee, Appalachee, and Timucua of northern Florida, there was carried back to Charleston for sale as slaves almost the entire population of 7 towns in all, some 1,400 persons. All right, and they'll tell you when you try to look for a lot of these tribes, which I learned about recently, the Timucua, right? These are tribes they never teach you about, right? But yeah, they're like, oh, what happened? They disappeared, or they exterminated. But you see what happened, really. All right, how many times did this happen that they got invaded, and then there's 1,400 now, and then another 1,400, here and there. Eventually, they blend in with other tribes, or they become, servants in plantations, and that's what really happened. Those are your ancestors, all right, so-called Negroes. The captives taken in 1715, when the Yamasee and Creek Indians made a foray upon the South Carolina frontier, were sold as slaves. All right, Mr. Johnston, a South Carolina missionary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts, in his letter to the Society, December 19, 1715, states, "It is certain many of the Yamusees and Creek Indians were against the war all along, but our military men were so bent upon revenge and so desirous to enrich themselves by making all the Indians slaves that fall into your hands, that it is in vain to represent the cruelty and injustice of such a procedure." Indeed, in the 1630s, the Connecticut River Valley was home to the powerful Pequots. The settlers at Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay wanted their rich, fertile land, and in order to get it, they persuaded Mohegan and Narragansett allies to help them fight the Pequots. All right, so your own people helped out in the invasion and conquest and enslavement. All right, and you heard what he said, fertile land. This is the terrestrial paradise. They've always wanted your fertile land, your paradise. In 1637, they burned a village on the banks of the Mystic River in southeastern Connecticut, killing 400 to 700 Pequots, according to Society of Colonial Wars in the state of Connecticut. That massacre turned the tide of the war, and Pequot survivors were pursued, captured, and sold as slaves. And many were sent to the West Indies and Providence Island, one of the islands off the coast of Honduras, where they were called cannibal Negroes. King Philip's War in the mid-1670s, which was fought to protest the English colonists' encroaching influence and forced labor of Native Americans, ended with as many as 40% of the Indians in southern New England living in English households as indentured servants or slaves. Indentured servants. The English colonists weren't the only ones to use the labor of enslaved indigenous people, of course. The Spanish were almost totally dependent on Indian labor in most of their colonies. Again, the Spanish were doing it first. They depended on Indian labor, Indian slavery or their colonies. Writes Alan Galloway for History Now. Enslaving Native Americans became one of the primary ways to expand the economy for colonists in South Carolina and to a lesser extent in North Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana. From 1670 to 1720, more Indians were shipped out of Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were imported as slaves. Again, if you didn't hear that, from 1670 to 1720, more Indians were shipped out of Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were imported as slaves. No Africans. You see the reversal they did? They flipped the game on you. They've been telling you lies this whole time. And Charleston was a major port for bringing in Africans, Galloway writes, supposedly. So you hear that? There was more Indians being enslaved going out than supposed Africans, because these were really other Americans that were coming up. They were being brought up. Throughout the Tuscarora War in North Carolina, Indian captives were retained or sold as slaves. At the beginning of military operations, following the Indian Massacre of 1711, the friendly Indians agreed to help the English against their enemy upon promise of a reward of 6 blankets for each man killed by them, and the usual price of slaves for each woman and child delivered as captives. During the course of the war, several hundred Indian allies were used by the English, and these allies took advantage of the opportunity to obtain large number of Indian captives to sell to the slave traders of the time. All right, you hear that? In an attack on an Indian fort in 1711, 39 women and children were captured and disposed of in the settlements as slaves. The 2 chief expeditions during the war were those of Colonel Barnwell, who was sent by South Carolina in January 1712, and of Colonel Moore in January and February of 1713. Colonel Barnwell expedition took 200 Indian women and children prisoners. The expedition of Colonel Moore virtually ended the war by capturing the fort in which the Tuscarora had taken refuge. 900 men, women, and children were killed or taken prisoners. And that's again what we really are, prisoners of war, POWs, not descendants of slaves. In both expeditions, the Allied Indians secured as many as possible of the captured Indians whom they took along with them to sell as slaves in Charleston. And they still further increased their supply of slaves by attacking the peaceful Indians along the route of their return to South Carolina. During the course of the war, more than 700 Indians were sold into slavery. All right, you see number 9 there, footnote. You want to go read it? It says Bassett, Johns Hopkins University Studies. All right, page 73. Go read it if you want. All right, we're in the encyclopediavirginia.org website. It says here, Indian enslavement in Virginia. Indians were enslaved in Virginia by settlers and traders from shortly after the founding of Jamestown until the end of the 18th century, peaking late in the 17th century and providing a workforce for English plantations and households. By this time, the Atlantic slave trade was at its peak, thus the hijack, all right, other American Indians, flooding Virginia with cheaper African labor. African slavery took nearly a century to develop. It took almost 100 years to develop. However, and in the meantime, while that was supposedly developing, those white Virginians who required men and women to work as servants or in tobacco fields mostly relied on indentured servants and enslaved Indians. Indentured servants. Europeans sold guns for slaves in an existing indigenous trading market and encouraged allied tribes to provide the slaves by targeting Indian groups on the periphery of English settlements, similar to African participation in the capture of slaves in Africa. Touch your own hijack. While there are some examples of continued enslavement of Indians throughout the early settlement period, mass enslavement typically coincided with the upheaval of war that led to Indian prisoners who could be sold as slaves, POWs. Virginia's laws were neither clear nor effective with respect to the enslavement of Indians, at times banning the practice and at other times encouraging it. Some scholars argue that Indian enslavement had declined by the 1800 because Indians were prone to illness or escape, but others maintain that it was only when Indians, racked by war and enslavement, could not provide sufficient quantity of cheap workers that English colonists turned primarily to chattel African slavery, thus to hijack other American so-called Negroes, Indians, indigenous people that were being brought up. American Indians were most clearly deemed free by Virginia law early in the 1800s, and Indians who were unable to gain their freedom often became assimilated within the predominantly African slave communities. They came what? The Indians became who? African American? The South Carolinians used some of these slaves to work their own plantations, but because of the ability of captives to escape over familiar territory among familiar peoples, their captors preferred to export most of them elsewhere. Capital from selling Indian slaves was used to fund plantations and purchase so-called Africans, thus to hijack. It was as if one could create capital out of thin air. The only effort lay in capturing the prey and transporting it to the market. Native peoples engaged in slaving for a variety of reasons. In exchange for captives, they received European trade goods. Many also hoped for forged closer relationships with the British. To refuse to become slave raiders, they risked becoming categorized as potential victims, with their enemies then filling the role of slavers. The result, a frenzy of slaving infected the region, as natives captured not only their enemies, but people they had never met. Some went farther and captured their friends and allies. Small-scale raids with attacks on fewer than a dozen people evolved into large-scale wars, with the British and the American Indian allies seeking captives in the thousands. Extending southward from Charleston, British and native raiders followed attacks upon the native peoples of Georgia, with a massive onslaught against Indians on Spanish missions in northern Florida. Systematically, the raiders extended all the way to the Florida Keys. Simultaneously, the English established important ties with the Chickasaw, who became the key slavers of the lower Mississippi Valley, the Chickasaw, extending their attacks west of the Mississippi and south to the Gulf of Mexico. The Chickasaw, surrounded by enemies on all sides, used slaving as a way to strengthen themselves at their enemies' expense, but great losses in slaving wars weakened them immensely. The numbers are difficult to calculate, but I estimate that 30,000 to 50,000, perhaps more, American Indians were exported from Charlestown. Thousands more were exported from ports like Boston and Salem, and on a much smaller scale by the French from New Orleans. Untold numbers which scholars are just beginning to calculate. You hear that, right? Will ultimately include the thousands who were not exported from their region but lived out their lives as slaves on the plantations in Virginia. We're talking about American Indians in this article. Remember that. We're talking about that you were never imported or you were never exported. You were enslaved in your own land, and thousands of you were not counted, living out your rest of your lives as slaves in these plantations from as an Indian enslaved, and then you lived out your life as a so-called Negro. In the records, colored in the records, as time went on, you were remembered as an African that was brought in when you were always there. You were from there. It's telling you right now, and this article is telling you, thousands were not exported from their region but lived out their lives as slaves on plantations in Virginia, as farm laborers in Connecticut, and domestics in New France. Although the scale of enslavement pales in comparison to African slave trade, toss your own hijack. It is notable, for instance, that from 1670 to 1717, far more American Indians were exported from Charlestown than Africans were brought in. Again, more American Indians from 1670 to 1717 were exported from Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were brought in. Does that make sense to you? Scholars long have known about the Indian slave trade, but the scattered nature of the sources deterred a systematic examination. No one had any conception of the trade's massive extent, and that it played such a central role in the lives of early Americans and in the colonial economy. As the African slave trade took off in the late 1700s, the Native American slave trade waned. Many remaining tribes had been pushed west, but something else was taking place that pushed the data down as well. Some Native Americans were intermarrying with African American. Dodge the hijack, these are all you, same people, they're all indigenous. The children were then referred to as colored. Again, what have we gone over? You are colored, you're Indian. They call you colored in the census records, right? They called you colored in the 60s. You're colored, colored only, right? Bathrooms for colored only. You didn't mix with Africans. These were other indigenous people, effectively erasing their Native American heritage. Smithsonian.com is telling you how they reclassified you as colored, and they're calling you African American. They're telling that you mixed with them, you became the colored race. That's what they're telling you. But you know, dodge the hijack, dodge your own hijack, you know what they mean. The enslavement of Native Americans thus became obscured, but modern DNA technology helped keep that story from being lost to time. The history of the enslavement of Native Americans continues to be a complicated and dark part of America's history, but it is one that deserves to continue to be researched and reconciled with. It deserves to be continue to be researched and reconciled with. All right, this happened. All right, it had an effect. Here we are living the way we're living today. The earliest of the slave-producing wars in New England was that with the Pequot in 1637. The war consisted of two battles, the Mystic Fight and the Swamp Fight. In the first, these two events, but 7 captives were taken. In the second, the Swamp Fight, about 180 captives were taken. 2 of the Sakem, taken in the Swamp Fight were spared, on promise that they guide the English to the retreat of Sasakus. The other men captives, some 20 or 30 in number, were put to death. The remaining captives, consisting of about 80 women and children, so they kept the women and children, were divided. Some were given to the soldiers, whether gratis or for pay does not appear. 30 were given to the Narragansett, who were allies with the English. 48 were sent to Massachusetts, and the remainder were assigned to Connecticut. The women and girls of the Massachusetts captives were distributed among the towns. It seems probable that Connecticut made a similar disposition of its share of the captives regardless of sex. The male children among the Massachusetts captives were ordered by the Massachusetts General Court in 1637 to be carried to the Bermudas by William Pierce and sold there as slaves. Indian children, not Africans, were sent, right, to the Bermudas, right, and they were sold there as slaves. The shipload of Indians, however, consisting of 15 boys and 2 women, was taken by Captain Pierce to the West Indies instead of to the Bermudas, and disposed of at the island of Providence. All right, big one right there. All right, so these Pequot, right, they were sent to Providence Island. This is off the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, around there, in between from those countries in Jamaica, and a lot of those people ended up with the mosquitoes or mosquito people, and they're supposed to be Africans, but we know, if you saw part 3 of this series, right, we know it was actually American Indians that they were taken there. And these same Pequot, they were called cannibal Negroes. They were calling them in another book. We can show you that. Cannibal Negroes. All right, so one Pequot seized near Block Island was sent to England. It is possible that this single cargo of women and children was not the only one sent to the islands at this time. A letter from the Company of Providence Islands, replying from London July 3rd, 1638, to letters from authorities on the island and directing that special care be taken of the cannibal Negroes brought from New England. What did I just tell you? And I didn't know this was on this book too. Alright? But I just told you, and I was going to show you the actual book this is written. This is quoted from. I have it. But you can see it right now. I ain't going nowhere. Alright, so it says, again, this letter said, yo, you need to take special care of these cannibal Negroes brought from New England. They're talking about Pequot American Indians, because there was so much rebels, right? They were like rebelling and kicking their ass up there, you know? So they said, take care of these special cannibal Negroes. They had to add the cannibal in there, right? And a second letter written in 1639, when the company, fearing that danger that might arise from too large a number of Negroes on the island, Negroes, all right? So we were talking about Indians, right? They have not mentioned bringing any Africans to these islands yet, right? So now all of a sudden, right? Let's go. What are they calling these cannibal Negroes or Pequots? They're calling them now Negroes, right? Now, you know, the whole thing's Negroes now, because now they're in the West Indies, so nobody knows their history, right? So they are, you know, dark skinned, so hey, Negroes, right? So again, fearing that the danger that might arise from too large a number of Negroes on the island, suggested that the Negroes be sold or sent to New England or Virginia, may possibly have been called forth by further purchase of Indians or by an exchange of Negroes for them. Still huge gaps in our understanding remain, and his beautifully written and National Book Award nominated The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, Andres Reséndez offers a tour de force account of the enslavement of Indians in the New World, and in the process broadens our definitions of slavery. Part of the challenge of the subject is that Indian servitude took many forms, making victims hard to identify in the records. Reséndez, a professor at the University of California at Davis, offers a capacious but defensible definition, including peonage, rebels sentenced to servitude, orphans and vagrants bound to service, victims of the mita, a forced labor quota imposed on Indian villages, and ostensibly free-wage laborers whose employers never paid them. Using this definition, Reséndez estimates the number of Indian slaves in the Americas at between 2.5 million and 5 million, fewer than the approximately 12.5 million Africans enslaved between the 15th century and the late 19th century. Dodge the hijack, dodge your own hijack. Prove these are Africans. From our studies, we're seeing that these are American Indians that are being brought up from the different parts of America, not from Africa. But a staggering number nonetheless. Moreover, he argues, though, listen to this, that population loss due to enslavement was in fact much greater in the Americas than in Africa. It was much greater in the Americas due to enslavement. Population loss due to enslavement was larger, much greater in the Americas than in Africa. Slavery, not merely epidemic disease, was the primary cause of the high mortality rates of 70% to 90% that some Indian societies experienced. In revealing the centrality of slavery to colonization, the other slavery amounts to a searing indictment of empire, starting with Christopher Columbus, who touted enslavement as a way of financing empire. Successive waves of conquistadores and colonizers profited from the trade in humans. Some, including Columbus, exported Indians to the Old World, so-called Old World, in a reverse middle passage. Reverse middle passage. But the vast majority of the enslaved remained in the Americas. By the time of King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, the colonists were well accustomed to the sending of Indian captives out of the country and to the use of them in their homes. So, servants in their homes. The policy followed toward the Indians captured in this war was the same as that shown in the Pequot War. The captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets. Where? European. Indians being sent to Europe. European slave markets. We already got the accounts of the Spanish sending American Indians to Seville, Lisbon, the Portuguese, Cape Verde, West Africa, and from there going to Holland and other places, right? In other European countries. Now, again, in this book, right, they're letting you know the captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets, or were retained in servitude in the colonies. Servitude. Again, pay attention. Servitude. They're going to keep throwing it at you. In the beginning of the war, Captain Mosley captured 80 Indians who were retained at Plymouth. In the following September, 178 were put on board a vessel commanded by Captain Sprague, who sailed from Plymouth with them for Spain. All right? How many? 178 put on a ship, a vessel, right? What is a vessel in those times? We're talking about ships, right? We're not talking about spaceships or anything like that, right? We're not talking about teleportation. We ain't talking planes. We're talking about ships, right? Deuteronomy 28, right? Or am I making things up here? 178 were put on board a vessel commanded by Captain Sprague, who sailed from Plymouth, right? Massachusetts, right? With them for Spain. In this same year, 1675, Indians, probably from the coast of Maine, were landed as slaves at Fayal, one of the Azores. West Africa? Huh? Azores, we're talking about Cape Verde, Azores, Madeiras, Canary Islands. A lot of those people are American Indians. They were bringing you there by the thousands. I hope the numbers are adding up in these last few videos for you. This is just the books I've read out to you. There's more numbers in other books. Again, in 1675, 15 Indians were captured and sent to Boston, tied neck to neck like a galley slaves. Who? Indians sent to Boston, tied neck to neck like galley slaves. Much against the will of the populace, they were given a trial. All were finally acquitted. They were acquitted. So these so-called African slaves, right? Remember, they tell us, oh, African slaves suing and going to court. And no, they were never. They were free people. They were American Indians. And they were able to prove that. All were finally acquitted except 2 who were sentenced to be sold out of the country as slaves. Wow. During the years 1675 and 1676, one finds mention of the sale of Indians in Plymouth in groups of about 100. Groups of about 100. How many groups? They're not telling us, right? How many groups of about 100? 10 groups would be 1,000, right? All right. 57, 3, 160, 10, and 1. From June 25 to 1675 to September 23rd to 1676, the records show the sale by the Plymouth Colonial authorities of 188 Indians. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a similar disposal of captives was accomplished. On one occasion, about 200 were transported and sold. There is extant a paper written by Daniel Gooking in 1676, one item of which is as follows. And it says, a list of the Indians, children, that came in with John of Pakakuhi. The list shows 21 boys and 11 girls distributed throughout the colony. With the close of the war after Philip's death, many of the Indian chiefs were executed at Boston and Plymouth, and most of the remaining chiefs with their captives followers were sold and shipped off as slaves outside the colonies. You see what they did, right? This is your ancestors, right? Where were they shipped off to? Could it one of those places be Cape Verde? And now listen, you're from Boston today, right? You're Cape Verdean, right? How do you know you're not American Indian? Why are there so many so-called Cape Verdeans in Boston, in New England? And why do they look like the tribes, the eastern tribes in those areas? Why do you guys look the same? All right, go talk to each other. Those transported were carried to various parts: the Spanish West Indies, Spain, Portugal, Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. All right, see all the places where American Indians were sent to be servants or so-called slaves, right? Spanish West Indies, right? The West Indies, Spain, right? Europe, Portugal. We're talking about Seville and Lisbon. These were huge slave markets, especially for American Indians. Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. Indian slaves from Caribana. Trade and labor in the 17th century Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. All right, so now we're really in the introduction, I guess. So it says here, in 1668, a member of Charles II's Trade Council, and read up on that, the Trade Council, Benjamin Worsley, considered strategies for supplying plantation laborers for the English sugar colonies, particularly the new acquisition of Jamaica. So they had taken this from Spain. So they had made a whole plan, right, to take over the wealth of the Spaniards in the West Indies. They wanted a cut in the trade, right? So-called trade, we're talking about the slave trade, plantation, encomiendas, repartimientos, right? So because they were growing and exporting it back to Europe, right? So they lost the battle in Hispaniola first, and then they went to Jamaica, and with little resistance took over the whole island, and that's how they gained Jamaica, the English. It says Worsley wrote that if the English Caribbean wanted to be sole masters of sugar for all the world, they could potentially use Guyana, the region of the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers, as a source for Indian slaves. Again, so these English were setting up shop, right? They had just acquired Jamaica. They're gonna set up a sugar plantation, and they're already planning to get their slaves not from Africa, right, but from the region on the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers. This is in Guyana, as a source for Indian slaves, not Africans. He argued that it would take less time and thus be more profitable, less time, right, than bringing people all the way from Africa, and thus be more profitable to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. More profitable, less time to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. There, the English might take advantage of the continual wars and differences that the Indians of Guyana have one with another, just as slavers in Africa had benefited from internecine conflicts near the coast. Worsley noted that many slaves could be found upon the coast of Guyana, many slaves who ended up going to Jamaica, who today are called so-called Negroes and are considered to be descendants of African slaves. But in actuality, many of these so-called Jamaicans, right, come from an ancestry that came from Guyana, from Caribes. All right, we already got in part 3, we got Aztecs going to Jamaica, right? We know the English brought many American Indians over to Jamaica as well, to the sugar plantations. All right, and we got Caribana Indians there as well. We know Jamaica was a hub for where they sent many of the American Indians as slaves. They were growing the plantations there. That was a hub, and from there they would take them and sell them other parts of Americas and even over to Europe. Yes, a slave port of American Indians, where the Indians do not only take one another prisoners, so they're taking advantage of the wars that were already there, the tribal wars between the peoples that was living in this region, and they would use one tribe against the other to get slaves, but do as usually sell one another for such goods as they lack in that country. Worsley had no direct experience in either the Caribbean or Africa, but he was a professional advisor. He knew what he was talking about, and his library inventory indicates that he had read multiple authors who referenced Indian slaves in the Caribbean. Multiple authors who had referenced Indian slaves in the Caribbean, including Walter Raleigh, we know that, Charles de Rochefort, through John Davis' English translation, and Richard Ligon. These sources were in no way advocating a regularized Indian slave trade. Indeed, although missionaries and humanists wrote about Indian slavery, and they abhorred precluding indigenous people from conversion to Christianity or subjecthood in the European monarchs or states through enslavement. Nevertheless, as this dissertation will highlight, each of these sources contained references to how Indian slaves contributed to the transformation of the Caribbean economy. So who had a strong influence in the transformation of the Caribbean economy? It was Indian slaves, and these sources contain many references of that. Just letting you know. Ad hoc purchases through captive markets and raids on indigenous communities during periods of war threatened Caribbean natives throughout the 17th century. Worsley's suggestion of a more institutionalized trade, which may have never been seriously considered, came to naught. However, his proposal reveals the importance of indigenous politics and trade on the Guiana coast and its impact on the successes and failures of colonial plantation economies. Not all the Indians whose lives were spared were transported. Generally, the men, rather than the women and children, were thus disposed of, though such was not always the case. So they get rid of the men, right? The protectors, right? Of the house, of the family. Leave you vulnerable, leave the women and children vulnerable. One finds instances like that of Philip's wife and son, when women and children were transported, and other instances, when grown male Indians were retained in the colonies and sold to the colonists. Not only were the Indians who themselves engaged in the war sold as slaves at home and abroad, but the wives and children of the captive males were also seized and co-signed to slavery. Again, co-signed or contracted, right? Servitude. In 1677, the Massachusetts General Court ordered that the Indian children, boys and girls, whose parents had been in hostility with the colony or had lived among its enemies in the time of the war, and who were taken by force and given or sold to any of the inhabitants of the colony, should be at the disposal of their masters or their assignees. In the case of a certain praying Indian who withdrew from the English side and joined the Indian enemy, not only himself but his wife and children were taken prisoners and held as slaves until redeemed by Eliot. The same policy was followed in Plymouth. A case in point is that of the chief Popanoi, whose wife and children were retained in the colony as slaves, while he himself was transported and sold into slavery. Alright, these are your ancestors being sold into slavery. Indian slavery complicates the narrative we have created of a white-black world. Again, Indian slavery, because it was you, complicates the narrative we have created of a white-black world. Those are just tags. Of course, it's going to complicate those terms. With Indians residing outside on a vaguely defined frontier, the Indian slave trade connects natives and European history so that plantations and American Indian communities become entwined. We find planters making more money from slave trading than planting. Again, we find planters making more money from slave trading, and we're talking about slave trading Indians, your ancestors, than plantain. And if we look more closely, we find Indians not only enslaved on plantations, but working as police forces to maintain those plantations and receiving substantial rewards for returning runaway slaves. We are also learning a great deal more about American Indian peoples. Most importantly, we can now tell the stories, the tragedies that befell so many who were killed in enslavement wars or spent their days as slaves far from their homes. They and their peoples have been largely forgotten. The Natchez, Westo, Yamasi, Yuchi, Yasu, and Tawasa are among the dozens of Indian peoples who fell victims to the enslavement wars, with the survivors forced to join other native communities. These are tales that Indians themselves have not told, just as the story of Indian slavery was excluded from the European past. It was largely forgotten in American Indian traditions. Americans often wish the past would just go away. Oh, it's in the past, forget about it. Save for those symbols we celebrate: Pocahontas saving John Smith, the noble savage, and the first Thanksgiving. That's your own hijack on all this. The image of pilgrims and Indians sharing a meal is one of the most cogent images we have of American Indians and of the colonization of this continent. We're still in the Encyclopedia of Virginia.org website. It says an early mention of an Indian slave appears in the context of the first Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609-1614. In his Triwi Relacion, George Percy recounts an English march on an Indian town guided by an Indian named Kempis, who was led in a handlock, and is described as a slave working under the threat of beatings and beheading. The war, meanwhile, resulted in English expansion outside Jamestown, which helped create another use for forced Indian labor. With the subsequent development of tobacco as a cash crop, came the need for an abundant and cheap labor supply to work the fields. Then on March 22nd, 1622, Indians under the leadership of Ope Chancano or Kancano attacked settlements along the James River, killing nearly a third of the English population, initiating a second Anglo-Powhatan War, 1622 to 1632. With the friendly tributary approach decaying, a new English policy toward the Indians was born of this violence and found expression in the official Virginia Company of London report of the 1622 attack, a declaration of the state of colony and affairs in Virginia, describing Virginia's Indians as a rude, barbarous, and naked people who worship the devil. The report's author argued that the Indians who before were used as friends may now most justly be compelled to servitude and drudgery. All right, we got this before, and you see how they just flipped it. All right, they were friends, but because they started defending themselves, then they became worshippers of devils, right? Barbarous and rude, right? And so they were justly be compelled to servitude and drudgery. So they was like, okay, we can enslave them now, or just make them our servants. As the historian C.S. Everett has explained, the enslavement of Indians from 1610 to 1645 tended to be a form of punitive retribution. And we continue in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times within the present limits of the United States. It says here both Plymouth and Massachusetts made a distinction between the children of those Indian enemies who were taken by force and those who voluntarily gave themselves up to the colonial authorities. The children of the latter were to serve as slaves only until 24 years of age, so they had a contract, right? The term of service, all right, not slavery, service of the former was not specified. All right, so one of the groups basically they didn't have a date for the servitude to end, so they probably eventually became chattel, right? Slavery, and the term. Neither Rhode Island nor Connecticut transported Indian slaves to the West Indies. Both colonies, however, retained Indian captives of King Philip's War, but only for limited periods of time, not for life. During the war, numerous bands of the Indians surrendered to the English at Providence and Newport. The sentiment of the colony against enslaving Indians, here as in Connecticut, the result of Quaker influence, had already been shown. So, in accordance with the spirit already expressed, it was voted by the town of Providence, August 14, 1676, to appoint a committee of 5 persons to dispose of the Indians there. The town agreed to abide by the action of the 5 men. The committee decided to sell the Indians in the colony for a term of years, one half the proceeds of the sale to go to the captors, and the other half to the public treasury. The length of service was to depend upon the Indian ages. Those under 5 years were to be simple bondmen till 30. You hear this? Alright, servitude. All above 5 years and under 10 till 38, above 10 and under 15 till 27, above 15 and under 20 till 26, such as were above 30, 7 years. Several receipts signed by this committee show that such sales occurred. Alright, so you hear all these so-called slaves had actual contracts, right? So when that time was done, they were free to go. And this is what they basically what they called in the census free blacks or free people of color. A few days before, the Rhode Island companies had brought in 42 Indians captives. These and all other Indian prisoners held at the time were sold into service in the colony for a period of 9 years. The Indians thus sentenced did not become actual slaves, according to the strictest interpretation of the term. Alright, so again, the Indians thus sentenced did not become actual slaves according to the strictest interpretation of the term, since the persons who acquired them purchased only their services, alright, only their services for a stated period of time, and not for life. Alright, not for life. Their condition is better explained by the term involuntary indenture servants. All right, we're in the National Archives website, Founders Online here. It says, to James Madison from William C.C. Claiborne, 21st of June, 1808. It says, sir, from the county of Opelousas, several Negroes have lately escaped the Spanish dominions, and several others who had designed to escape have been arrested. These events have excited much uneasiness among the farmers of the territory, and they await with impatience the interference of the general government. There has arisen another cause for anxiety among the holders of slaves. You are doubtless apprised that in the early settlement of Louisiana, Indians taken in war were permitted to be holden in slavery, and it is reported to me that in this territory there are now several hundred persons held as slaves, talking about Indians, who are descended of Indian families. Under the Spanish government and during the administration of Baron Carondelet, the auditor of the province had encouraged a claim set up by some of these unfortunate people to freedom, but it is understood that in consequence of the Baron's interference the proceedings were stayed and the question remained undecided. A lawyer a few months since brought a suit in the parish court of Opelousas against a citizen who held in slavery some Indian descendants. The assembly then in session took up the subject and passed a bill declaring that every Indian who was a slave before the taking possession of Louisiana by the Spanish government, and all other individuals of both sexes born from said Indians are and shall remain slaves. The bill was rejected by the executive upon the ground that it was worse than useless. If by the former and existing laws of the territory these people were legally held in slavery, the proposed measure was unnecessary, but if otherwise, no act of this government could reduce them to bondage, and an attempt to do so would be a reproach to the legislature. The suit above alluded to have been determined in favor of the plaintiffs, but the merits of the defendant's claim were not urged, these being reserved for the discussion before the Superior Court, to which I learned an appeal is to be made. The holders of these persons state that many years ago there were frequent wars among the several nations of Indians in the vicinity of Louisiana, and that they sold their prisoners as slaves with the assent of the colonial government to the French inhabitants. It is also stated that the colonial government made slaves of certain Indians found in arms against the French, but the claimants of Indian descendants for the most part trace their title, I am told, to purchases of the former description. I am, sir, with great respect, it says William C.C. Claiborne. Resendez describes the boomtown mining centers of Mexico, notably Parral, which spurred a trade in slaves over a 1,000-mile radius and even reached into the Philippines. 200 years later, California gold rush entrepreneurs such as John Sutter also exploited female Indian labor. Even the Euro-Americans determined to eschew Indian slavery, including Jesuit missionaries, the Mormons, Kit Carson, and the U.S. Army, ended up participating in it. Missions in Sonora became militarized presidios that enslaved and relocated thousands of Seri Indians. Brigham Young eventually temporized with a law that permitted Mormons to ransom captive children and hold them in bondage for 20 years. So you see, all these people, these Jesuit missionaries, Mormons, and all these people that supposedly were trying to help, and they're so religious and Christian, right? They were helping enslave your ancestors as well. One of Resendez's major contributions is his pursuit of the story of Indian slavery from Spanish America north into the 19th and 20th century United States, showing the continuities. Involuntary servitude continued in California and the Southwest even after the Civil War. Resendez implies that the other slavery didn't end until well into the 20th century because its many forms made it difficult to stop via statute, and because too many landowners had a stake in its continuance. The book arrives amid a lively debate over slavery and capitalism. While Eric Williams' 1944 Capitalism and Slavery, University of North Carolina Press, suggested that the African slave trade capitalized British industrialization, the other slavery reveals that Indian slavery funded colonization itself, the whole colonization. Moreover, since Indian slavery flourished from large industries to small households and farms, Resendez's works opens up new paths for thinking about how slavery made it possible for many Americans, not just big planters, to participate in the market revolution. Laws barring the importation of Indian slaves probably had the effect of limiting the visibility of Indian slavery, driving the trade underground and limiting the willingness of slave owners to advertise in newspapers. However, these laws were not particularly well enforced or effective, and within months of the act passage in Massachusetts, an advertisement was placed in the Boston Newsletter selling a Carolina Indian woman in Boston. Connecticut affirmed the failure of its 1715 Act to prevent trade in Indian slaves when it passed a similarly worded law 35 years later. However, the law demonstrates the inability or perceived inability of the New England colonies to assimilate foreign Indian slaves into colonial society. Furthermore, Indian slaves had the potential to incite or contaminate Indian and African slave populations by linking slave communities to the free Indian communities within and about us, which maintain a degree of autonomy and sovereignty in New England. We're just talking about Harriet Tubman, right? How did she know the Underground Railroad and all these routes that were actually old ancient trading routes that led to the mounds? Do the research, all right? During King Philip's War, Connecticut suffered nothing on its own soil from hostile Indians. In consequence, the number of captive Indians enslaved was small, and only infrequent mention is found of these captives. A certain amount of the booty which the Connecticut troops assisted in taking fell to their lot, and among this booty were some of the captive Indians. An interesting record of such a slave is found in the account book of Major Tom Talcott, 1674-1688, which includes his accounts as a treasurer of the colony during King Philip's War. On opposite pages of the ledger occurs the following account: 5455, 1676, Captain John Stanton of Stonington Drive, to sundry commissions given Captain Stratton to proceed against the Indians, by which he gained much on the sale of captives. Contra, 1677, April 30. Per received an Indian girl of him, about 7 years old, which he gave me for commissions, on the other side, or at best out of goodwill for any kindness to him. In consequence of the small number of Indian captives enslaved in the colony, none was transported by colonial action. The privilege of thus getting rid of undesirable and troublesome Indian slaves by selling them out of the colony was, however, conferred upon individual owners. When May 10, 1677, The General Court decreed, for the prevention of those Indians running away, that are disposed in service by the authority, that are of the enemy and have submitted to mercy, such Indians, if they be taken, shall be in the power of his master, to dispose of him as a captive by transportation out of the country. During the Indian Wars in Virginia, Governor Berkeley himself, in a letter, 1668, to Robert Smith, militia, commander in the Rappahannock country, not only proposed that, with the consent of the Council of War, a war of extinction be waged against the Northern Indians, but also suggested that the colonial government defray the expenses of the undertaking by the disposal of the women and children. Smith submitted Governor Berkeley's letter to the Rappahannock Court for approval. In rendering their decision, the justices declared that the conduct of the Northern Indians, notably Duagos, and the neighboring Indians, justified the taking of severe measures against them, and accordingly advised, with the assistance of Almighty God, by the strength of our northern part, utterly to eradicate them, without further encroachment than the spoils of our enemies. Alright, you hear all this, right? Indian slavery is an important part of South Carolina's history that many know nothing about. No other state has as many historic documents that chronicles Native American slavery as South Carolina. For all you who reside in the state of South Carolina, go into the many historic documents that are chronicled there of Native American slavery. Do the research. As the historian Labor concludes, American Indian slaves were most numerous in South Carolina, and the number of Indians exported was larger than that from any other colony. Indian slavery intermingles with every aspect of the colonial record of South Carolina. Indian slavery began soon after settlers arrived and persisted through the colonial period. Knowing about the Indian enslavement is important, impressive, and persistent role in the history of South Carolina, and because it has affected the Native American citizens of the state. Indian slavery contributed to the development of the colony economically, agriculturally, politically, and legally. Indian slavery in colonial South Carolina made a large and indelible mark upon the tribal histories of the American Indians, not only of South Carolina, but of the southeastern United States. In short, the destiny of many of the American Indian tribes of the region was influenced and determined by Indian affairs, which centered in Charlestown. All right, so I'm just going to read again from this book. We got it before. It's Lies My Teacher Told Me by James W. Lowen. And again, it says here, right in the beginning, it says, Columbus not only sent the first slaves across the Atlantic, he probably sent more slaves, about 5,000, than any other individual. To her credit, Queen Isabella opposed outright enslavement and returned some Indians to the Caribbean, but we already read that that didn't last too long. Nobody really followed that law, in reality. But other nations rushed to emulate Columbus. In 1501, listen to this, the Portuguese began to depopulate Labrador, transporting the now extinct Botoc Indians to Europe and Cape Verde as slaves. These are people from Nova Scotia up there in Canada. They call it Labrador, Newfoundland, those areas. And what happened? The Portuguese transported, it says, the now extinct Botoc Indians to Europe and Cape Verde as slaves. After the British established beachheads on the Atlantic coast of North America, they encouraged coastal Indian tribes to capture and sell members of more distant tribes. Charleston, South Carolina, all right, we just got this, became a major port for exporting Indian slaves. Again, Charleston, South Carolina, became a major port for exporting Indian slaves. The Pilgrims and Puritans sold the survivors of the Pequot War into slavery in Bermuda in 1637. The French shipped virtually the entire Natchez nation in chains to the West Indies in 1731, and we read before that that was to Haiti. They got sent to Haiti, the Natchez. Alright? It is not known how many Indians were enslaved by the Europeans, but they were certainly numbered in the tens of thousands. It is estimated that Carolina merchants operating out of Charlestown shipped an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 Indian captives between 1670 and 1715 in a profitable slave trade with the Caribbean, Spanish Hispaniola, and northern colonies. You see, these were Africans that were supplying the island of Hispaniola with. All right, how many accounts do we have to see? All right, just go back to all the videos. All right, I hope you're keeping track. Because of the higher transportation costs of bringing blacks from Africa, again, because of the higher transportation costs of bringing blacks, so-called blacks from Africa, right? It's common sense, right? Whites in the northern colonies sometimes preferred Indian slaves, especially Indian women and children, to blacks. Dodge the hijack. All right? So you had the slave force here, indentured servitude. You had it here. You didn't need to get it from Africa. Carolina actually exported as many as even more Indian slaves than it imported enslaved Africans prior to 1720. All right, we got this. The usual exchange rate of captive Indians for enslaved Africans was 2 or 3 Indians to 1 African. Dodge the hijack, another American Indian that's being called African.